In the years leading up to 1972, George Carlin was a relatively well-known comedian who performed tame and safe satirical routines about the entertainment industry. He was, however, pushing to free himself from that routine. His third album, FM and AM, released in 1972, illustrated that he was already drifting towards more risque counterculture comedy. On his fourth album, also released in 1972, Class Clown, would be a landmark, particularly the 7 words you can never say on television routine, which became the focus of government harassment. Furthermore, it became his most famous calling card. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, comedians, and the power of words. I am your host, Jason Nemore Harden, inviting you to join us as we explore George Carlin's 7 words you can never say on television. George Dennis Patrick Carlin was born on May 12, 1937, into a turbulent childhood. Now, the main cause of that turbulence was Patrick Carlin Sr.'s excessive drinking. You see, when Patrick, his father, drank, he became violent. Now, George's mother, Mary, would refer to Patrick as a street angel and a house devil. Now, she refused to allow George to suffer the same routine beatings and trauma as his 5-year-old brother, Patrick Jr. So when George was a mere 2 months old and Patrick Jr. 5, Mary fled with the boys in the middle of the night. Now, once Patrick Sr. found out they fled to Mary's father's apartment, he attacked the house in a fit of violent rage, doing his best to knock the door down. Mary and the boys narrowly managed to escape his wrath by way of the fire escape, then jumping into her uncle's car and speeding away. Now, she and the boys would practically be homeless for the next 3 years, but at least they escaped. Well, Mary soon divorced Patrick, and Patrick soon thereafter died of a heart attack. Now, George grew up in what he would refer to as White Harlem, namely Morningside Heights in New York City. There, he would exercise the few talents he considered himself to have. Now, not at all a gifted fighter, he concluded that stealing, lying, and entertaining were his strengths. He could often be found standing on the stoops of buildings telling jokes to friends. Though he'd inherited hardly anything positive from his father, his knack for speaking was definitely one of those few positives. Now, actually, both Mom and Dad had a gift and love for speaking, which they passed on to their sons. Now, his father, for instance, had won the Dale Carnegie Speakers Contest against 600 other entrants, while his mother loved to tell stories, often putting on voices and creating characters as she did so, solidifying humor and the love of words in the mind of young George. Now, as a consequence of growing up with a single mother, he was often alone, so to combat the solitude, he found friends, and more importantly, voices. Voices on the radio. He wasn't particularly attracted to comedians on the radio. When he was able to get to the cinema, the likes of Danny Kaye, Bob Hope, and Red Skelton soon became favorites. Now, he aspired to become like them. Then came a turning point, his first communion. Bred a Catholic, he was told that he would notice a major difference inside of him after his first communion at age 8. Now, when this noticeable difference failed to occur, he felt tricked, and from then on, he never really believed much in authority again. He became a rebel. By age 13, he was smoking marijuana and dropped out of school as soon as he could. In the 9th grade. Quote, "My own experience of authority is one of opposing to, not just questioning authority, but actively opposing it and trying to undo what it had in mind. All authority comes from within. All my power comes from within." End quote. By the time he reached 25 years old, George had an unmatched admiration for Lenny Bruce. The story goes that one night at the Gate of Horn Club in Chicago, Bruce was arrested for on-stage obscenity. Now, George happened to be in the audience as the police harassed and demanded that patrons show their IDs. But George, despite having his ID on him at that moment, proudly declared that he did not believe in ID. So he was arrested right alongside Lenny Bruce. Now, as fate would have it, of course, he was seated in the back seat of a cruiser right next to none other than Lenny Bruce. A dream come true. Bruce then asked George why he was arrested, and George told him that he had refused to show his ID. Bruce then called him a schmuck and smiled. Now, one must assume that the rest of that ride to the police station and their time together in jail was well worth the arrest for such a fan as George. Now, here's the kicker. At the time, George was in a comedy duo with Jack Burns. Now, soon after their stint in jail, Lenny Bruce came to check out their act. He liked it. Now, this led him to recommend their act to some folks he knew. Now, a strong argument could be made that George's night of rebellion that night in Chicago at the Lenny Bruce show led to the comedy duo of George Carlin and Jack Burns being signed to a major label. Kind of cool, right? Well, unfortunately, the duo soon deteriorated. George wanted to pursue a solo career which proved to be very fruitful. You see, his comedy was safe and family-friendly and brought in a lot of money. However, he felt like he'd lost a part of himself in the process. He wore a suit and tie and was on TV. What could be wrong with that? Apparently, enough. While the Vietnam War and racial wars were running rampant, he found himself making jokes about these social occurrences to 40-year-olds who were at war with their 20-year-old children. Then, enter acid. Acid would shake things up. After dropping acid a few times, he found his way back to the outlaw rebel he'd left behind. He was ready to swim against the tide once again. He shed his suit and tie, grew his hair, his beard, and started being the same person on stage as he was off stage. Quote, "There are 400,000 words in the English language, and there are 7 of them you can't say on television. What a ratio that is. 399,993 to 7. They must be really bad. They'd have to be outrageous to be separated from a group that large. All of you, over here, you 7, you bad words." End quote. Class Clown is the 4th album released by George Carlin, but the second one after his change from a more mainstream humor into his new style, and the one which solidified his career as a real provocateur. It was recorded on May 27, 1972, at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium in Santa Monica, California, and was released on September 29th of that same year. The genius of Class Clown resided in the blending of comedy that worked on a more basic and primitive level. The routine was based on the shock value of coarse words that appealed to a younger audience. Additionally, it tackled more mature issues such as Muhammad Ali and the Vietnam War. Then there was the closer, which is still considered one of the best routines by any comedian ever. Now, to trace back his famous routine, one must dive into his love of words. Age 12, coming out of Mueller's ice cream parlor on Broadway, he saw his pal Mickey beating the crap out of a Juilliard student across the street. Now, the subject of the beatdown was a classical musician with long hair. Now, in 1950, that was the only long hair that existed. Now, Mickey was yelling, "You long hair fucking music prick!" That phrase struck a chord with George. Long hair, fucking music prick. He wrote it down. Then there was the time he heard this guy, Chris, calling Mrs. Kohler a kraut cunt. Kraut cunt. Another winner. He jotted that one down. Then there was the guy who came home from military service, and George asked him, "What was it like being in the Army?" His reply, "Fine if you don't mind waking up at 5 in the morning with some burly, loudmouth cocksucker yelling at you." Burly, loudmouth cocksucker. Now that one had rhythm. Loud, burly cocksucker was not the same at all. So, of course, that made it to paper as well. Now, soon he had a list of about 10 of these words or phrases. Well, his mother found that list and threatened him with psychiatric help. Now, 20 years later, after starting that list, it bore fruit as it contained all the 7 words you can never say on television, aka the 7 dirty words. Now, throughout 1972 and early 1973, the excitement grew and grew. It was a time for firsts for George, including the first time he sold out a theater or a club. He would keep the handwritten sign from the main point, a little folky room near Bryn Mawr, west of Philadelphia. About 400 people crammed into the place. The venue hung a sign on the door. Sold out. Then there was the first time he got caught in his own traffic jam. The first time he was driving to a theater and got stuck in the traffic he created. It was a fabulous feeling. Well, as usual, a price had to be paid for all this ascension. It was July of 1972 when he discovered that not only could you not say the Heavy 7 on television, you couldn't say them in Milwaukee, Wisconsin either. The Associated Press reported it as such. Comedian George Carlin was taken into custody Friday night and charged with disorderly conduct after he allegedly used profanity during a performance at Summerfest, a 10-day festival on the city's lakefront. Henry Jordan, executive director of Summerfest, said, "Carlin got up on stage and he used a lot of profanity. The police charged the stage after his act and arrested him." Jordan said he supported the police, adding that many in the crowd of 70,000 were children. According to the arresting officer and complainant, Patrolman Elmer G. Lenz, about 40 of the many thousands of children were youths in wheelchairs who were physically unable to leave the showgrounds, even if they found the show was in bad taste. What Patrolman Lenz didn't know was how close he came to actually nailing Carlin, who at this time was addicted to cocaine. As a matter of fact, he had quite a load of the drug on him while on stage that day at Summerfest. What saved him? His wife, Brenda. You see, she heard that the police were waiting for him backstage, so she came onto the stage under the pretense of bringing him a glass of water. She softly whispered in his ear, "There's police backstage, and when you come off, they're going to grab you and arrest you." So George exited the stage on the side where he knew the police would not be. He handed his jacket containing the drugs to some guys he knew. The police swoop in immediately after the handoff and arrest him. George knew he dodged a bullet that day. 5 months later, Judge Geringer threw out the case, stating that while he had no doubt indecent language was used, he didn't believe anyone was violently aroused. Interesting choice of words, but Judge Geringer's choice nevertheless. Funny thing is, it wasn't a recording of the concert that was played in court, but a clip from the Class Clown album. The routine obviously worked on several layers. As the Milwaukee Journal reported, during the recording, Judge Geringer grinned and laughed, softly, though self-consciously. Patrolman Lenz was incensed by the judge's ruling and said the hearing was a railroad job, although the only person who could have been railroaded was George, and he made sure not to be. Judge Geringer's decision sidestepped the First Amendment and the guarantee of free speech that time. George wouldn't be so lucky, however, the second time he came under fire for his words. On October 30th, 1973, WBAI in New York broadcast a cut of his routine during a program called Lunch Pail. It was in the midst of a discussion about society's double standards toward language. And the host warned the audience in advance that, if you don't like this sort of thing, don't listen. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court would later summarize that a New York man who, while driving with his young son, heard the WBAI broadcast, wrote a letter to the FCC about the use of such language on the air. Now, after some back and forth between the FCC and WBAI, the FCC released a declaratory order in 1975 concerning the broadcast of indecent language, defining indecent as words that describe in terms of patently offensive as measured by contemporary community standards, sexual or excretory activities and organs at times of the day when there is a reasonable risk that children may be in the audience. Yeah, that was a mouthful. Anyway, the FCC found Carlin's routine to be indecent by that standard and put what amounted to be a warning in WBAI's license file. And WBAI, to their great credit, fought it and won in the U.S. Court of Appeals. The FCC appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1978, the Supreme Court, surprise, surprise, found in favor of the FCC, 5-4. The Los Angeles Times ran the story as its front page lead on July 3, 1978. Court bans 7 dirty words, blared the headline. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote the majority decision, saying, the broadcast media have established a uniquely pervasive presence in the lives of all Americans. A patently offensive, indecent material presented over the airwaves confronts the citizen in the privacy of the home, where the individual's rights to be left alone plainly outweighs the First Amendment rights of an intruder. Again, a mouthful. Justice William Brennan wrote the dissent. In our land of cultural pluralism, there are many who think, act, and talk differently from the members of the court and who do not share their fragile sensibilities. It is only an acute ethnocentric myopia that enables the court to approve censorship of the communications solely because of the words they contain. The court's decision is another of the dominant culture's efforts to force those groups who do not share its mores to conform to its own way of thinking, acting, and speaking. It was obvious to Carlin that the court was banning not just words, but ways of thinking, acting, speaking, communicating with one another. There was plenty more hypocrisy at work. The original and sole complainant wasn't some average Joe who conceivably might have been speaking for contemporary community standards. He was named John Douglas. John Douglas was a member of the board of a big-time right-wing watchdog group called Morality in Media. John Douglas was, in Nat Hentoff's words, a professional offendee. Of course, he couldn't turn off the radio because that would have meant taking his right hand from its 10 to 2 o'clock position on the steering wheel and committing the hideous sin of reckless driving. However, he could have told his quote-unquote young son to change the station for him, especially considering how his quote-unquote young son was actually 15 years old. Much older than Carlin when he began to make his list of offensive words. FCC v. Pacifica Foundation has become a standard case to teach in communications classes and many law schools, something Carlin took a perverse pride in. Actually being a footnote to the judicial history of America is not something to be frowned upon. And what he liked the most was how all 9 members of the Burger Court had to sit around and listen to the complete bit. He often wondered if, during the presentation of the evidence against him, any of them grinned and laughed softly, though self-consciously. Well, in 2016, Class Clown, including the infamous routine, was selected for preservation in the National Recording Registry due to its cultural, historic, or artistic significance. A great victory in both the annals of stand-up comedy and free speech. As usual, let's end this episode with a powerful quote from the legend himself. "It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it." End quote. Rest in peace, Mr. Carlin, and thank you for your words. And thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/House of Words or paypal.me/House of Words podcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.